Exclusive. She had mapped every inch of her home in her head. The way light slid over the oak staircase at noon, the soft whisper of the conservatory's glass on winter nights, the exact spot in the south wing where a draft would always gather. Wealth had given Vivienne Marlowe a kind of cartography. Money bought security, staff, even secrets. What money had not bought was certainty. Not about the small, persistent things that made her stomach tighten. A late lamp left burning in the nursery, a faint smell of smoke that no one else could find. The way Emily, tall, deliberate, 25, would sometimes stand at the window as if listening to something on the lawn. Vivienne watched Emily during the day like she watched paintings, close, clinically, cataloging details. The nanny moved through the house with a practiced economy, folding laundry with the kind of tenderness Vivienne associated with people who kept their hands busy to stop thinking about things that hurt. She had been hired 3 months ago, a quiet referral from a charity Vivienne's philanthropic office supported. Emily needed work. Vivienne needed someone to fill a domestic seam she'd neglected. In public, Vivienne would say she had a fondness for careful people. Alone, she told herself she had a need for reliability. The first night Vivienne followed her was a night that began ordinary and ended with the world reset along different cartographic lines. Rain had pared the estate to chrome, the gravel shining. The moon was a thin coin above the yew hedges. Vivienne waited until after 10, told her housekeeper she was burning the midnight oil in the study. She wore a coat with a borrowed simplicity, black, unmarked, and padded down the hallway with the light-footedness of someone trying not to startle the house she had never fully trusted. She had no reason to follow Emily, no proof, just a taste of curiosity that had been nesting inside her since the way Emily hesitated before plunging a hand into a chest of drawers once, fingers brushing something Vivienne could not see. It was a small thing, but Vivienne had learned to listen to small things. They usually announce larger truths later. The corridors smelled of beeswax and old paper, paintings watched, ancestors whose faces looked like they had been bored one day centuries ago and stuck around to look on. Vivienne slid past the nursery door ajar, a sliver of light like a cigarette ember. Inside, stilled toys lay in careful disarray. A mobile hung unmoving, its wooden moons casting lazy shadows. Vivienne's footsteps were silent on carpet, but the house seemed to notice. Somewhere beyond, a clock clicked louder and then softer. She could feel her pulse in her throat. At the back of the house, a service door stood between her and whatever Emily planned to do. The gardener's courtyard smelled of wet soil. Vivienne moved like someone slipping into a painting of a different life, less a steal than a decision, to look, to know. Emily was already there when Vivienne rounded the corner. She was not alone to the backyard. She had lit candles at the base of the old stone sundial, and the light turned her into a thing of wavering edges, more shadow than person. The candles were not the kind you bought in boxes. Their wax was pale and layered, rings upon rings like tree trunks. They had a smell, wax, smoke, something floral underneath that Vivienne could not place. The nanny's hair was tied back in a way that made her neck long. She held an object wrapped in cloth. Vivienne's first thought was mundane. She should have called someone, but her throat was tight with a curiosity she could not name. She took another step forward, and the gravel complained under her shoe. The sound snapped Emily's head up. "You shouldn't be out here," Emily said, voice steady but unguarded, because Vivienne was family, or employer, or someone who needed to be placated in the night. "You'll wake the house." Vivienne did not step into the candlelight. She kept the dark as a kind of magnifying glass. "What are you doing?" Emily's fingers tightened around the wrapped object. For a sliver of a second, Vivienne thought it was a toy, or a bundle of cloth the color of old paper. Then Emily unfolded the cloth and set it beside the candles. It was a book, small, bound in leather so dark it drank light. Its cover had a faint pattern like veins in marble, and in the middle there was a tiny, incised mark that could have been a symbol or just a maker's mark, a circle with a slash through it. The leather smelled of dust and iron and something older. For a reason Vivienne could not, she stepped closer. She knew enough of lore to know not to speak aloud the ridiculous things she half feared. What if books kept their own voltage? What if a particular leaf could hum? She had the ridiculous list of things the world had taught the wealthy. Hire lawyers before you hire lovers. Secure the house before you buy the art. She had never been taught how to look at a person who could call a shadow by name and not blink. Emily's lips moved. The sound was not a word Vivienne recognized. It was a sequence of low vowels and clipped consonants, like someone stirring a spoon in thick honey. The candles flared as if to answer. At first, it felt almost theatrical, an enactment of something old. Then the air chilled, as if a door had opened in winter. The shadows beyond the garden hedges pooled wrong, like spilled ink refused a brush. The small, sensible world rearranged itself. The shadows were not the absence of light anymore. They were texture. They gathered like people assembling at the edge of a room. Vivienne's breath came shallow. She was supposed to call the police, to confront Emily. Instead, she watched. The shadows listened. They moved at the perimeter, soft as moth wings, and then one unfurled and slid over the grass toward the candles. It touched the flame, and the wax hissed as if in pain. The nail of a flame blackened. For a blink, Vivienne thought she saw a face form inside the darkness, a mouth that opened and made no sound, eyes like holes. Then Emily's voice rose, and the face withered like paper left too long in water. A sound traveled up Vivienne's spine, a small animal chittering of fear. The woman's hands were bare. When she reached for the book, the glyphs on the leather shivered, and something like the quick pulse of a heart nudged against her palm. Vivienne wanted to sweep forward, to take the book by force and hide it away somewhere light and cheerful. Instead, she felt the book's heartbeat under Emily's fingertips, and it made her dizzy. "Who taught you this?" Vivienne asked, softer than she meant. Emily did not answer with a who, she answered with a why. "They come when people let their walls thin," she said, "when someone keeps a door open in their head." She looked at Vivienne then, not at the candles or the book, but at Vivienne's face, as if trying to measure how much of a person was behind the eyes. "You keep many doors open, Miss Marlowe." Vivienne wanted to bristle at the title. She preferred Vivienne, but the phrase hit a place under her ribs that had been sore for years. She thought of the trunk where she kept Kate's letters, the little brass locket that Vivienne sometimes wore under her blouse when the house felt too loud. Kate's name hid in the curve of the locket, K. Vivienne had been careful never to wear it out in the world. She had not expected someone to notice. "You shouldn't be doing this in my garden," Vivienne said, but the sting of something else, shame maybe, radiated through her. It's reckless. Emily's jaw worked. "You could lock it away," she said. "You could bury secrets and buy silence. But that doesn't keep things from finding their way back. It only makes them more curious." Vivienne thought of all the things she had shelved, letters she never opened, photographs shoved into boxes, apologies unsent. She had spent money to make the house immaculate, as if cleanliness could perform atonement. The book and Emily and the candle flames all suggested a different economy, where currency was not bills but attention, where neglect was a magnet. A movement at the hedgerow broke the spell. A shadow, long and ragged, untethered itself from the darkness and reached for Emily's ankles. Vivienne's reaction was immediate, a reflex more animal than social. She lunged, smothered the thing with her coat, yanked it away. The shadow rolled like spilled ink, but Emily's hands were already on the book, chanting. Words grew in Vivienne's ears, not words she could catalog, but a tide of cadence. The nearest candle flared and guttered. The shadow recoiled as if stung. For a moment, the three of them, Vivienne, Emily, and the book, were an island. They pushed the shadow back across the grass. Its edges cracked and bled out into the night. But then something like laughter skittered across the air, thin and high. "You used it," Vivienne said when they were back inside, the night pressing against the windows like a thing listening. The house seemed relieved to have them return. Doors sighed. The study light flickered. Emily wrapped the book in the same cloth and tucked it into the hollow between the stone hearth and a stack of wood. "It's not mine to use," she said. "I keep it because it helps. It keeps them away for a time." It summoned them. The statement landed like a coin with a dull ring. The shadow's laugh echoed in Vivienne's bones. "You opened something." Emily looked at Vivienne as if measuring whether the woman could endure a truth without crumpling. "You follow me because you wanted to know. Now you know. If you want to close your doors, make sure you know which locks you're turning. This book isn't black and white." Vivienne stood very still. In the corner of the study, a framed photograph caught her eye. It was of Kate, laughing in front of a summer picnic, sunlight braided through hair. Kate's grin was the sort that made people's faces soften. Vivienne had wanted that photograph buried. She had wanted to iron the edges of a past she could not fix. Now it sat in the study like a door left ajar. Emily's explanation made little sense in the ledger of Vivienne's life. Yet she could feel a thing she couldn't name threading itself into the house's bones, a wrongness that would not be cleared by money or staffing. The night had shifted. Curiosity had flung open a window that allowed the dark in. They spent the next 48 hours under a pressure that felt like gravity. Vivienne moved through them with the deliberateness of someone reconciling a balance sheet and finding an unusual loss. The staff hushed their voices. The cook put aside herbs she had planned to use for dinner as if they might carry mischief. Vivienne called Emily into the library under the pretext of discussing schedule changes, and found herself needing less and less pretext as the days dragged. They did not speak of the garden that first night except in careful hedged sentences. But people who do the same work together start to build language, small phrases, touches, a lid placed back on a book in a certain way. Emily wore her hair loose at the nape when she worked with Vivienne in the study. Vivienne found excuses to stand near the stove where Emily prepped meals, and sometimes they would share a look over a simmering pot that felt like a private semaphore. "Are you with me? Yes. Do you see this? Yes." Vivienne found herself listening for the laugh again. She heard it once in a draft that moved through the conservatory, and another time in the way a wind chime across the courtyard tapped out notes that were almost words. Each time it came, it felt farther away and closer at the same time, like memory. They reached for explanations in the obvious places first. They opened encyclopedias, scanned forums late at night, looked through archives for anything that could name the symbol on the book. Vivienne had the resources to get the right eyes on the problem. Professors, anthropologists, a woman who dealt in manuscripts for museums. She convened 2 meetings and learned that experts were properly skeptical. Leather ages, symbols reappear across cultures. Meanings get braided together by accident. The woman who sold artifacts talked in careful disclaimers. Provenance is everything. Context transforms meaning. "It's likely a later binding," she said, palms up. "Someone remade an older text." She held the leather delicately, reverent as a relic of a past life. But she would not speak the word that had lodged in Vivienne's throat. She would not say summoning or doorways. Experts are trained to disfavor stories that make people feel small and out of control. They prefer lists and files, the calm of a ledger. In the back corridor, Vivienne sorted through a drawer of small things she kept for herself. A button from a coat she had loved, an old receipt. She found, wrapped in tissue, a locket. The brass was dull. When she clicked it open, the photograph inside was of Kate, younger, hair cropped, as if she had been daring the world. The name helixed on the inside rim. K. Vivienne's throat tightened, and for the first time she had the sense of being watched by her own past. The first time the shadows came into the house proper, they did it like a rumor, soft at first, impossible to locate. Vivienne and Emily were sitting in the study at dawn, the house still and waiting for the day. Emily had the book between her hands on the table, wrapped now in a clean scarf. The cover bore the imprint of a circle, so worn it had become a whisper. They were discussing the book's bindings, theories, provenance, when the lights dipped and the air tasted metallic. The candle Vivienne had lit for no reason at all guttered. A sound came from above them, like silk being dragged across a room. Vivienne's hands went to the locket under her shirt, the way a person reaching for a talisman touches the thing that is least likely to do anything. It was a movement small and obscene. She chastised herself even as she did it. The shadows came as a chorus. They seeped under doors like spilled ink, and then pooled into eyes, sliding down walls. The first manifestation was small, a smear in the air that took on the profile of a child when it passed the nursery doorway. For an instant, it was almost human. Skeletal fingers, a face that was a suggestion. Vivienne felt the past nick through the present like a knife, and in that nick was the shape of Kate, smiling, calling, turning away. "You have to be steady," Emily said. Her voice had the rasp of someone who had rehearsed calm until it became a tool. She pulled the book toward her, opened it without ceremony. The pages were thin as onion skin, edges frayed. Glyphs swam on the paper, elliptical, looped, like a script trying to remember itself. Emily did not mouth the words. She breathed against them, and the air hummed. The shadows retreated a fraction, making a sound like discontent. Vivienne joined, more out of instinct than knowledge, humming a note that felt like the right interval. She felt absurd. She felt better. The shadows scraped at the edges of the room and then fell back as if against something invisible. For a moment, safety felt like a thing you could purchase with a breath and a ritual. Vivienne's world rearranged itself, the house a little smaller, the space between past and present manageable. But the shadows were not simply shadows. It occurred to Vivienne that they listened for emotional frequencies, fear, regret, longing. They found small doors and widened them. They found the hollow beneath her ribs and moved there like greedy animals. After they pushed the first wave back, the house was quiet in a way that felt exhausted. The staff moved with a new caution, as if the night had rearranged their memory of what belonged in a house. Vivienne sat at the study table, the book closed now and asleep like a cat, while Emily sat opposite, shoulders squared, hair falling loose. They did not speak for a long time. Outside, rain tapped in steady dots. "I thought I could handle it on my own," Vivienne admitted finally, the words out of her before she could fan them to cool. It felt prurient and childish to tell someone she had buried a sibling memory, that sometimes at night she would sit in the dark and list the things she had not said to Kate. Emily's face softened. "Some doors are heavy," she said.
They have hinges that want another hand. And if I open it, Vivienne said, feeling the words like pebbles, if I pry at the hinge? It will show you what's on the other side, Emily said, coldly wise, and it might not be what you expect. There was a frankness in Emily that Vivienne had not seen in those who served her. When you lived with people who owed you wages and not devotion, intimacy took on different shapes. The nanny was not a counsel of comfort. She was a woman who had been on the other side of the hedge and survived. Emily had the tired attention of someone who had seen the way things could skew when private grief was left unattended. They made a pact that night, not by words, but by small convenings. A safe place to keep the book. Vivienne insisted it be in the vault of the study, behind a lock no one knew. Emily argued for a place where the light could touch it sometimes. They compromised by putting it in a cedar box with the cloth around it and locking it in the back closet. The gesture felt pointless and sovereign at the same time. It was also the only thing like an agreement they had. For days, interiors moved like a story told in a lower register. Vivienne pulled at file folders, looked at old ledgers with Kate's handwriting, an old shopping list, the margin notes that betrayed a mind distracted and kind. She began to chart memory the way she charted finances, making notes in the margins, cataloging triggers. Emily went out at night sometimes, returning with trays of herbs that Emily swore were benign, rosemary, bay. She talked about them in domestic ways, simmer for scent, tuck into a drawer for calm, gestures that felt like superstition, but were earthly at least. The third night after the garden incident, Vivienne found Emily up on the roof, perched by the chimney with her legs folded beneath her. She was singing low, guttural notes that startled a hawk out of the cedar. When Vivienne crouched beside her, the nanny did not look surprised. "You sleep?" Vivienne asked. "No," Emily's voice was thin. "I watch. It is better to see them from above." "Are they dangerous?" Emily's face was a geography of endurance. "They are hungry," she said. "They like histories. They prefer people who hoard regrets." Vivienne looked over the estate. Moonlight scudded across 3 tennis courts and a reflecting pool. The estate seemed to belong to a different century when seen from the roof, an island of cultivated green in a map of darkness. She felt dizzy with the strangeness of wanting to protect it all with a knowledge she did not have. "Why do you keep the book?" Vivienne asked then, because it had begun to feel like an immoderate question, and because the answer might tilt whatever fragile understanding they had. Emily's hand went over the leather of the book's cloth and under the scarf where it slept in the closet below. "Because someone has to," she said. "Because if no one remembers, then the thing becomes hungrier. Because I once watched a house lose a girl to a hole in the floor. Someone took the child because she had nowhere to put her grief. I promised I wouldn't let it happen again." Vivienne's face tightened. The word child alarmed her, too direct a touch against her sensitivities about children, and she felt an old defensive fury. How old was she? "Too young," Emily said. "About 6. They took her like a sheet blowing off a line. That day, I learned this book binds and holds, and sometimes repels. I learned that rituals are not recipes. They are conversations, whispering instructions. They don't always translate." Vivienne did not ask if any of this was real. She felt the impatience of someone used to asking questions and getting answers. The world now presented her with pages that would not turn. She had to work within margins. A week became a ledger of smaller encounters. The shadows tested them in minor, increasingly personal ways. A smear on Kate's photograph, a clock that counted down and then rewound, the voice of someone whispering a childhood nickname only Vivienne had used. They cataloged and named and tried to inoculate their lives with policies. No solitary walks at night, bulbs left on, the book always in its box. Vivienne, with money's usual bluntness, acquired cameras, infrared arrays that watched corridors like second pairs of eyes. The devices recorded anomalies, heat maps with cold spots, frames that showed nothing, and then a smear. Vivienne watched these frames in the library with Emily late at night and felt the same intimate fascination that had led her to follow. Watching was both remedy and temptation. The thing about curiosity is that it asks questions in a tone that makes you keep answering it. The more Vivienne watched, the more the house revealed itself as a place of sedimented grief. It was not just a house, it was a bank of histories that someone had neglected, and neglect is a kind of currency these things could spend. Then, on a night when the wind held its breath, Vivienne found a photograph that was not hers. She had been sorting through the attic because the attic had always been a place where the estate's secrets gathered like dust bunnies, and a small envelope fell into her hand. Inside was a photograph of a girl standing in front of an iron gate with a silver paint flaking from its bars. The gate was open, and beyond it lay a path through a garden that looked oddly like part of the estate she owned in her head but not in the world. The girl was younger than Kate had been in most photos, hair a dark bob, eyes serious. On the back, in a hand that was not Vivienne's, someone had written a name, Kate. Vivienne felt the ground tilt. The photograph was the kind of thing that could unravel a tidy story. Someone had put Kate in a place she did not know existed, or vice versa, and the gate was not a real gate she could find on any map of her property. The edges of the photograph were warm when she held it, as if something behind it exhaled. Vivienne took the photograph downstairs. Emily sat at the kitchen table cleaning a knife while the rain made music against the windows. The house had that small domestic glow, like a lamp inside a bell. That was in the attic, Vivienne said, placing the photograph between them. Emily looked at it without surprise, the way someone who held an account of strange phenomena might. Silver gates, she said. They are often markers, thresholds, places where things collect themselves. Her fingers tapped the table a beat too quickly. They are rarely gates in the way you think they are. Vivienne studied Emily then and understood a private calculus forming in the woman's face. Emily did not speak of faith in a devotional sense. She spoke of things the way a nurse speaks of injuries, methodically, with an economy of vocabulary. "Where did you get this?" Vivienne asked, because it felt like the right question. Emily's eyes were steady, but her mouth was thin. "I did not get it," she said. "It was placed where I could find it. The book does that." Or the thing that guards the book does. Sometimes it wants a witness. Vivienne felt heat rise in her, a small, sharp indignation. The notion that something placed this photograph to be found felt like a violation. She thought of the nights when she had walked past Kate's closet without opening it, of the times she had put a note to herself and then thrown it away. Things had been left undone. The house gave them back in new shapes. That night, they agreed to watch more, not with the blunt force of hired security, but with a tenderness Vivienne was not used to exercising. They would not tell the staff everything. They would not call in men with metal detectors and loud machinery that scraped at the household's privacy. Instead, Vivienne and Emily made a smaller plan. They would test the book, gently and with boundaries. No summoning props, no calling names aloud without a shared purpose. They would seek information in human form, histories, registries, local legends. They would keep a journal together, a ledger of impressions. They would sleep in pairs in rooms whose doors were closed. Vivienne lay awake that night with a little brass locket at her throat. Moonlight spilled across the bed and made patterns like filigree on the sheets. She thought about the choices that had led her here. the choice to hire a compassionate nanny rather than simply housing and surveillance, the choice to keep possessions in boxes rather than confronting them. She imagined the openings in her life as actual doors. Some she had left unlocked because it had been less painful not to know. There is a peculiar loneliness to being rich and frightened. Everything you own becomes evidence in a trial you did not expect to be part of. Vivienne had the resources to produce answers by spending, but not all problems take currency. Some took courage. Some took confession. When she woke, the house smelled faintly of smoke and lilies. The candles had burned down in the closet where the book slept. The cedar box had been pushed back an inch, like sleep had shifted. She went to Emily, who had started a kettle for tea. Emily's hands were steady. On the kitchen table lay the photograph of the gate, and beside it, a small scrap of paper Vivienne had not seen before, with a word that made the skin on her arms rise: gate. Vivienne said nothing, but she felt the ledger balancing in a new way. Curiosity had expanded into a plan. The house had yielded a clue. Somewhere in that clue was the shape of Kate. At the far end of the hall, a clock chimed 8 times. In the living room, a small shadow, no larger than a hand, passed across the wall like a fly. The sound of it amused something up and down the rafters. Vivienne felt a stirring then, a sensation of being observed by a narrative that had been written in someone else's hand. She did not know then what she would be willing to risk to find the truth, nor did she know what debts she would owe at the end of any bargain.
She only knew the reverberation in her chest when she slipped Kate's name from the locket and let it lie open on the table. The name was a weight. She looked at Emily and recognized, with a sudden, piercing clarity, that the woman who had followed the path through the hedges that night had become something else entirely. Not a servant, not exactly, but an ally in a precarious bargain. For the first time in a long time, Vivienne felt an alliance form that was not about power. It was about mutual survival. Outside, wind moved through the eaves and made a sound like a laugh, small and distant, like someone ticking a match at the end of a long sentence. The sound might have been nothing, but Vivienne had begun to trust sounds she used to dismiss. She placed the photograph of the gate next to Kate's locket and watched the two objects in a private, trembling way, as if, by doing so, she might stitch an old map back into being. At noon, she summoned a box of things from the attic. There, under an old coat, she found a note in Kate's hand, the looping, impatient scrawl of someone who wrote lists the way others breathe. On it, in a margin, Kate had written a place name and a symbol like the one on the book. Vivienne slid the note into her pocket. She felt the house press close, as if willing her forward. Later that evening, with the cameras set like a perimeter of small eyes, Vivienne and Emily sat and made lists: people to contact, places to visit, and a set of small rules to keep themselves human. They would not speak the full names aloud yet. They would not call in bright lights that woke the estate's staff unnecessarily. They would do this privately. When Vivienne left the room for a moment to check the cameras, she returned to find Emily staring at the closed closet where the book slept. The nanny's shoulders were hunched in a way that suggested she was both expectant and afraid. Emily's lips moved, shaping something that was almost a prayer and almost a warning. Vivienne, who had been taught to resolve problems with balance sheets and legal teams, was discovering a new habit: a willingness to hold hands with a stranger over the abyss. She felt the house's corridors like arteries that pulsed with small, living things: candles, photographs, names. The book in the closet hummed, a low throb Vivienne could feel at the base of her skull when she stood too close. They slept that night with the doors inside the house closed but not bolted. There is a difference between safety and isolation,
And Vivienne, who had thought isolation a form of control, was learning that it could be a trap. At 3 in the morning, a sound woke her, a floorboard's soft click, not the sound of servants moving, but a measured tread that belonged to the house itself. Vivienne slipped out of bed, the locket in her hand, and walked the corridors in stocking feet. The house was a thing of breathing shadows and low moons. In the nursery window, something moved that was not a person, a smear of darkness that took on a familiar posture, like someone leaning on a gate and watching. Vivienne did not call for Emily. She did not reach for a weapon. She walked toward the nursery and opened the door. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of the candles from the night before. On the windowsill, reflected in the black glass, she saw a face that was not Emily's and not her own. The face was the shape of a sister, a tilt of chin, a grin that used old jokes. It looked at her with eyes that held all the things Vivienne had not said. The face mouthed a single word. It was a name. For a moment, Vivienne could not move. Memory condensed into a presence that felt like a physical hand around her heart. The photograph of the gate, the locket, the book, all of it assembled into a narrative that would not let itself be ignored. Behind her, a whisper of movement told her Emily had come to the doorway. The nanny's silhouette was soft with uncertainty. Together, they stared at the reflection until the face in the window dissolved into condensation and finally into night again. The sound of wind in the eaves laughed, closer this time, like a person testing a joke on a crowd. They did not speak of what they had seen, but the silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that bargains make, heavy and attentive. Vivienne felt the old architecture of her life shift. She had pried open a door and found an entire, hungry house on the other side. If you love exclusive horror tales, subscribe for more. They resolved, in the end, to be deliberate. They would read the book under daylight. They would take notes. They would, as a small, stubborn act of normalcy, make a plan for the next day. Visit the county registry, request files, and ask questions of people who might remember gates and gardens that had since been erased. Vivienne spent that day in the registry office where paper lived like a stubborn truth. The clerk was a woman with thin glasses who could make a river of handwriting look orderly. She pulled records with the scent of a midwife. Vivienne watched the names pass under her fingers and felt like a thief reading the lives of other people. She found in an old ledger a reference to an estate on the edge of town whose map had been redrawn after a flood. The writing noted a gateway by a silder fence that had been removed and sold to some buyer who had no memory of why it had ever been built. Vivienne left with photocopies in her bag and a number for a man who claimed to have salvaged part of a gate in years past. She also had the attic note from Kate's hand, which she now carried like a directive. It appointed a place on a map she did not yet understand. The rain outside had smoothed the city into a watercolor smear. Vivienne's shoes made soft checks on the pavement. Back at the estate, Emily awaited with tea. Her face had the concentration of someone who has been entrusted with a long, small duty. They sat across from each other and compared lists like accountants. Vivienne felt the odd alchemy of companionable fear settling over them. The house around them sighed and settled. For the next week, they followed the paper trail, moved through rooms and into records, pieced together fragmentary histories. A gardener's letter from 60 years ago referenced a silver gate with a footnote about a girl who used to prefer the path beyond it. Nothing was explicit. Everything was elliptical. The language of records is precise in its omissions. Their investigation was not just external. They interrogated memories. Vivienne opened boxes of Kate's things. She read letters and found in margins a scrawl that made her stomach knot. I am not the brave one. The admission cut open something in her. It was not the kind of confession that allowed redemption by check. It simply made the past present, a living thing that had votes in the room. Emily confessed more in small moments than in declarations. Once, while they were cataloging old maps, she slipped and said, "I did not always know the rules. I used to think I could bargain alone. That was an illusion." Her hands trembled as she handled the maps, as if the paper might burn. Vivienne regarded her with a new shape of respect. Money had taught Vivienne to prize independence. Emily's quiet, habitual admissions were showing Vivienne a different currency, vulnerability traded for trust. Alone in her private office, Vivienne wrote the name of the town and the gate onto a sticky note and placed it over the shelf where she kept Kate's letters. The note felt like an accusation rather than a solution. The shadows tested them incrementally. A portrait that found a new bruise overnight, the nursery mobile turning with no gust of air, a clock that once again ran backward for 7 seconds. Each occurrence was a small question. Will you forgive yourself? The thing listened for an answer. Vivienne's dreams had the texture of film negatives. Flickered images, a gate, Kate's laughing face, a rope of candles. She woke with the taste of copper on her tongue. Slowly, the edges of the house's map tightened into a single line. There was a place beyond the gate that mattered. One evening, after a day of records and phone calls, the house felt narrower, as if the walls had inched closer to listen. Vivienne sat in the study with a stack of photocopies and the loose scrap of paper Kate had written. The lamp threw a pool of gold over the paper. The rest of the room pooled into blue. Rain made the windows into slow-moving glass paintings. Emily moved through the kitchen beyond the study door, her figure a practiced silhouette as she set plates and wiped away crumbs that could not, in truth, be blamed on anyone. They had agreed to a plan that was more moral than strategic. Gather information, close minimal doors, keep the book out of sight, and, when necessary, meet in pairs. They had also built a list of questions, brittle as fine china. Where the gate in the photograph had once stood, what the symbol on the book might mean in a cultural lineage, whether the thing in the shadows required anything like an invitation. That evening, Vivienne had returned to a notebook full of half-answers, and to a new, unwelcome certainty that whatever they faced did not respect property lines or census data. She looked up as Emily entered the study with 2 cups of tea. The nanny set one down in front of Vivienne and glanced toward the closet where the cedar box rested like a small, sleeping animal. "Did you call the man in the salvage yard?" Vivienne asked. Emily's thumb ran along the rim of her mug. "He'll meet in the morning. He has a piece of iron he thinks might be from a gate." Vivienne imagined an iron gate with flaking silver paint, its bars like bones leading to something else, and felt the familiar itch of a hunt. She should have felt steadier. She did not. Instead, the name Kate, small and stubborn, throbbed under her ribs. A noise, soft at first, came from the corridor. It could have been a settle-in of the house, a cup sliding on its saucer somewhere far off. The lamp flickered. The air tightened. Something shifted like breath under fabric. Vivienne placed her hand on the locket at her throat as if it were an anchor. The shadows moved like a rumor. One pooled against the foot of the bookshelf and took a long, congealed breath. The pages of Vivienne's photocopies ruffled, though the air was still. Emily's shoulders went taut. The nanny's fingers closed on the mug. "Not here," Emily said quietly. The shadow uncoiled, and, with an almost theatrical cruelty, formed into something that resembled Kate, only sharper, like a photograph where a negative had been overexposed. For a sick second, Vivienne forgot the rules of the house, and moved as she had in other nights toward the apparition with the rawness of someone trying to stitch a wound shut with bare hands. "You have been seeing her," Emily said, not reproachful but frank, as one states a fact. "She visits when the margins of regret get thin. She smells like the places you will not go." The shadow Kate smiled with a perfection of cruelty. It was an offer and a trap. The air tasted of iron. Vivienne wanted to cross the room, to touch the face that looked like an old film still and snap it like a brittle negative into reality. Instead, she did the only thing that had come to feel like a first defense. She took a breath and put her hand over Emily. Emily's fingers were warm and certain. "What does she want?" Vivienne asked, the question small as if spoken toward a sleeping child. The figure in the dark spoke without moving its lips.
The voice was Kate's, shaped by the same cadence of jokes and small betrayals. "You've been tidy, Vivienne. You have balanced the books and cleared the shelves. But what is tidy cannot fix what is gone." The shadow's hands, if they were hands, traced old ledger lines, numbers smearing into dust. Vivienne felt a coldness enter the room, as if someone had opened a window onto winter. "Please," Vivienne said. The word was a handful and felt like a crack in her armor. She had spared herself confessions by hiring people to keep things orderly. In the presence of the ghost, the armor felt childish. Emily tightened her grip on Vivienne's hand. "We are not alone in this," she said. "You will not go through it alone." They did not banish the shadow that night with any triumphant cry. Instead, through the small work of humans, lighting resilient candles, rubbing their palms together, speaking nonsense syllables from the book in the most careful of harmonies, the thing dissolved into a wash and retreated into the spaces where light misbehaved. It left behind the scent of rain and an echo that felt suspiciously like laughter. The next weeks were measured in small battles rather than large ones. They scoured archives until the clerks grew tolerant of their strange questions. They visited a quiet antiques dealer who spoke of trades and tradespeople as if naming the seam where something might slip through. They found in an old ledger of sales a notation that a gate, described as ornamental iron with silver overlay, had been removed from a property after a flood. The entry included a half-name, a purchaser who had moved to the city. The trail threaded through time like a needle through cloth. Vivienne hired someone to meet the salvage man at dawn. When the two men walked the old property where the gate had once stood, an overgrown parcel of what had been a communal garden, the rusted remnant of metal lay like a fossil, curled and encrusted. The man grunted, considered the piece, and warned in his blunt way, "This kind of iron finds ways to carry stories. Take it with care." He did not say it in a mystical voice. He said it like someone commenting on bad plumbing that leaks. But Vivienne felt the sentence as if it were a band pressed across the chest. She had wealth and people who could translate ledger entries into maps, but the story behind the metal would not be traded for cash. It demanded a human scale of attention. At night, the house grew more cunning. The shadows learned the contours of routine. They began touching objects in ways that felt intimate and invasive. A photograph bowed as if someone had breathed on it. A handkerchief folded differently. The nursery mobile rotating the wrong way. Each small change stabbed at Vivienne with more precision than brute force could have achieved. The thing's tactic was to erode the line between memory and presence until Vivienne could not tell whether a recollection was a thing she had stored or a thing that had been placed there by something hungry. Emily kept the book wrapped, but its cloth was no longer mute. It hummed like a throat clearing.
The leather's glyphs seemed to twitch under the cloth in a rhythm that felt almost like respiration. They tested it gently, Emily reading and stopping, Vivienne listening, and over time they learned to detect the book's moods. It responded to fear like a bell to a touch. During a late-night meeting with an elderly archivist, a woman whose hands had lived in paper and glue, Vivienne learned a phrase that felt like a threshold. "Places keep time differently," the archivist murmured, stirring a pot of tea as if it might dissolve impossible questions. "Memory is an architecture as sound as brick. When people neglect a place, the architecture sags. Sometimes other things move into the sag because there is room." That is all a lot of metaphors, but metaphors are sometimes the best tools we have. Vivienne wanted less metaphor and more a map. The old woman's damp eyes, however, gave Vivienne something else, a small ledger note indicating an old property record, a page where the name of a garden path and the mention of a silver gate had been marked as an oddity. It was not proof, it was a direction. Vivienne took the direction like a vow. It was in one of those small, relentless nights that Emily finally spoke in fuller terms about why she had kept the book. They were sitting on the back stairs, feet tucked against the wood, watching the sky bruise from storm to deep night. "There was a family once," Emily said, "not the kind that is in your books. They were ordinary people who kept an ordinary home with ordinary grief. Someone in that house, maybe a child, maybe a woman, left their sorrow in the attic and went on as if it were nothing. After a while, someone else came in who noticed the old sorrow. It wasn't malicious at first. The first stranger was curious, and curiosity slides into hunger. Things learned the house's rhythms and then began answering the grief with shapes. They could make you see something because they knew what you had lost. That is the cruel form of lesson. You wish for what is gone, and they hand you a version of it so you will inch toward them." Vivienne felt the cold place beneath her ribs, that economized grief, tighten. "Did you lose someone?" she asked. Emily squinted at the stair treads, like someone trying to read a map in poor light. "Yes," she said, "I lost a girl once. I have said that so many times in my head, it became a profession of shame. She was 6. I was watching another door. It is a sentence I carry. I promise you this. It is the thing that made me stubborn enough to keep the book. You do not keep an object like that because it offers comfort. You keep it because someone must be willing to hold an edge." Vivienne listened without offering the usual defenses she had learned to use in boardrooms: contracts, contingencies, absolutes. There was no glib, no purchase to be made in that exchange. Only this: 2 women with their pasts knotted together by a leather-bound thing that neither fully trusted. Their alliance tightened into something like training. They practiced together under daylight, Emily reading the gestures from the book, Vivienne mimicking until the movements felt less foreign. They recorded the phenomena on the cameras, long frames where blackness pooled and then peeled away like spent fruit skin. The more they watched, the more the blackness seemed to prefer private triggers: an unspoken phrase, an old nickname, a photograph glanced at too long. It listened like a person listening for the thinnest slit in a door. The book, for its part, revealed only fragments. Pages bled into each other with syntax that avoided direct instruction, diagrams that suggested thresholds, and circles that pulsed like a heartbeat. Sometimes a line of text would shimmer and then become unreadable, as if the letters were shy. They learned a second language: how not to ask the book for answers it refused to offer. Instead, they gleaned hints: the phrase "silver gate," the mention of a path beyond a fence, an ornamental pattern that matched the photograph Vivienne had found in the attic. The city salvage man delivered his piece of metal with clumsy reverence. It lay on the study table like an accusation. The iron had once been painted silver. Traces of the paint clung in flaked fragments. The metal's curve suggested a post, and along one bent filigree there was a small twist that mimicked the glyph on the book. Vivienne excused herself to the balcony for air. It felt as if a memory had been given a body. "We can make a ritual at the place," Emily suggested, tentative as if she were offering breath to an open flame. "We can stand at the threshold with the book and speak together." Vivienne stared out over the gardens, the estate's night-lit bones arranged like bones in a reconstruction. She thought of the ledger of omissions in her life. She thought of Kate's laughter and the locket that felt increasingly like a key rather than a keepsake. The idea of crossing a threshold made her stomach rock. Of all the ways to engage with grief, to step into a memory space seemed both the bravest and the most foolish. "There are risks," Emily added, reading the expression that had become so familiar on Vivienne's face. "You may find the image of Kate waiting in another form. It may ask things. Be sure of the hand you will take when it asks." Vivienne felt the old, simple economy of wealth whisper in the corners. Hire more people, call in the specialists. Each solution had the polite dryness of a financial report. Money could purchase safety of sorts, but not absolution. The gate, if it existed, was not subject to a purchase order. They planned quietly.
They would go to the site of the salvaged gate at dawn when no one was likely to be about. They would bring the book wrapped as always. They would keep to a ritual of their own design, a set of gestures that relied upon each other's presence more than upon incantation. They would trust their practiced cadence, and if anything in the beyond required a bargain, they would bargain together. Dawn found them at the edge of the old Barden plot. The city's fog had not yet burned off, and the salvage man's truck stood like a relic at the road. The iron arch they reconstructed from the salvaged pieces was incomplete, a suggestion of a gate rather than a gate itself. They set the arc of metal into the ground as if trying to coax a doorframe out of memory. The air here was different, not colder exactly, but charged as if something had been waiting in suspended battery. Vivienne unwrapped the book like a nurse unfurling cloth to reveal a wound and set it on a flat stone. She half expected it to pulse at the presence of the iron. For an instant, she thought she felt the leather vibrate, a small, impatient beat. Emily knelt, folded her hands, and began to hum a tone that had become their safe interval. The sound, when matched by Vivienne's own hesitant breath, filled the space between the metal curving into an arch and the stone on which the book lay. It was not an incantation with instructions. It was a call, the rhythm of which they had learned to sense from the pages. The shape of the gate filled in like an image coming into focus. Where the iron did not meet, a faint silver shimmer traced itself in the air. The world around them shifted in the small way that suggests a film reel's frame was removed. The trees lessened their rustle, the sky paled into a high, even gray. "Hold my hand," Emily said. Vivienne took it. For a breath, the simple contact felt more potent than any ledgers or security plans. It was a human tether. Together, they stepped through the arch. What lay beyond was not a garden, nor a realistic extension of the estate. It was a city of memory, a place built from the architecture of things that people carry. Streets were paved with photographs, their images worn smooth by constant replay. Lamplight here was made from the amber color of late memories. The horizon was awash of things that nearly were names. The scent that hung in the air was not of earth, but of time, dried grass and the tang of iron and the sweet sour of old cake left in a tin. At first, the frame was cinematic, intentionally beautiful and sharply uncanny. Shop fronts with names that suggested the people who once lived in Vivienne's head.
a playground where the swings creaked with the sound of missed promises, a fountain that bubbled with voices reciting the scraps of apologies. The book in Vivienne's arms hummed, its pages whispering like moth wings. They were not alone. Figures moved in the periphery, silhouettes that were more suggestion than person.
From them exuded the whisper that had grown familiar, a chorus of small, mocking sounds that tested the edges of courage. A shadow with too many fingers traced the rim of a photograph on the pavement, and, where it passed, the picture shivered and then showed for half a beat a different moment, Kate with hair darker and eyes that were kinder. They pressed on, each step a small decision to continue being present to the world that had condensed into a living archive. The deeper they moved, the more the city rearranged itself to their private topography. Alleyways opened into Vivienne's life, a rehearsal dinner where she had smiled too brightly, a hospital corridor she had stepped through on a morning she could hardly remember, a small bench upon which Kate sat knitting a scarf in a scene that should have never been there. There were traps. At the corner of a low stone building, Vivienne nearly walked into a tableau that promised a reunion. Kate, laughing, calling her name from inside a room full of light. For an infinitesimal moment, every muscle in Vivienne wished to run toward that room. The thing knew her too well. It knew the exact flavor of nostalgia that would make her abandon vigilance. The shadow versions of memory separated themselves into handlers, each one trained in the art of misdirection. They offered shots of what might have been if she had done different things, if she had paid different attention. The city was a gauntlet of could-have-beens. Emily's voice kept Vivienne anchored. "Name me," she said quietly when the temptation rose in Vivienne like a tide. "Name something real." Vivienne's hands closed on Emily's. "You," she said with the kind of bluntness that comes from a shocked heart. "You are real." That small, true declaration pushed back the thrall of the illusions. The forces there were not merely malevolent, they were opportunistic, and they needed complicity to become absolute. Vivienne's refusal to go alone collapsed their authority like breath upon soot. They moved toward the city center, where the book hummed with a frequency that suggested a heart beating unevenly. The path of the streets here was lined with fragments of things Vivienne had tried to tuck away. A theater ticket from a night Kate and she had argued. A child's drawing she had thrown away. The pressed petals from a bouquet that had been early and then late. Each artifact was a vector. In the square at the center, if it could be called a square, stood a gate befitting the photograph. A silver archwork that promised boundary and threshold. Beyond it, the city's memory softened into a thick, low fog. And there at the center, in a pool of lantern light, the shadow of Kate stood whole and near enough to touch. "Vivie," the apparition said. The voice was unbearably familiar. It was the nickname spoken with an intimacy that predated the ledger of injuries. It felt like oxygen, and for a second, Vivienne thought she would simply melt into it. She realized that to choose the apparition over Emily would be to repeat the old script, pay for solitude with the bones of another's life. She turned instead to the book and to the city around them. The book's pages were open now, the glyphs pulsing like a slow, complicated heartbeat. Vivienne and Emily took each other's hands and, without ritual instruction, fell into the shared cadence they had practiced a dozen times, less an incantation than a duet. They spoke in the prayerless way of people who have learned to keep each other whole, not with commands, but with named, true things. They said the names of those they loved aloud: Kate, Emily's lost girl, small things that mattered. And as they did, the book thrummed. The city's air pressed back,
but the unity of the two women made a different kind of force. The shadows surged with the taste of a last breath. They made a sound like a choir roughened by flame. Figures in alleys leaned forward like thieves anticipating ripened fruit. The air tasted of old metal and summer kitchens. For a wild, fragile moment, Vivienne felt that something had indeed shifted. Between her and Emily, a line had been drawn. Not a line of ownership, but a promise. The apparition of Kate watched them with eyes that were full and ancient. "You were always the brave one," the figure said. There was no bitterness now, only a small, tired softness. "You said you were not." Vivienne sank with the small, violent relief of someone who has been granted a reprieve they did not earn. She did not save Kate that day in the way she might have fantasized, dragging a memory across into the living world like an animal pulled from water. Instead, the apparition smiled, a sound that might have been forgiveness or might have been a release. The city shuddered. Figures made of regret and hunger contracted as if pulled to a pinprick and then folded like paper into a matchbox, tiny embers that would not die easily but would be contained for now. The book's heartbeat slowed. The silver gate dissolved into air like exhaled breath. They stepped back through the arch and found themselves in the garden as the morning leaned into a raw blue day. The iron on the ground was plain now, ordinary metal with a story. The book lay quiet, its cover still and unreadable. They were both shaking, not because they were cold, but because something inside had been altered. Vivienne's hand went automatically to the locket at her throat. It felt lighter. "You did it," Emily said, not triumphantly, but in a way that acknowledged the long negotiation they had just endured. "No," Vivienne said after a breath. "We did it. We did it together." The victory was not a tidy one. The house still creaked in the evenings as if laughter, thin and knowing, traveled through its attics and rafters. The book remained in the cedar box, its cloth a mute testimony to the bargain, powerful, ambiguous, dangerous if handled alone. The victory was not a tidy one. The house still creaked in the evenings as if laughter, thin and knowing, traveled through its attics and rafters. The book remained in the cedar box, its cloth a mute testimony to the bargain, powerful, ambiguous, dangerous if handled alone. The victory was not a tidy one. The house still creaked in the evenings as if laughter, thin and knowing, traveled through its attics and rafters. The book remained in the cedar box, its cloth a mute testimony to the bargain, powerful, ambiguous, dangerous if handled alone. Vivienne had not been granted an absolution that wiped out memory. Instead, she had received something narrower and more durable, a sense that guilt could be held and that choices could be made differently. The ledger remained open in places, but the margins were no longer the only thing that mattered. In the days that followed, the estate breathed differently. The staff began, slowly and without fanfare, to relax their watchfulness. The camera footage still showed anomalies, cold spots, frames where a smear lay for a few frames then was gone, but Vivienne found herself no longer cataloging them with a frantic need to control. She was learning, haltingly, to live with the fact that some things cannot be reduced to accounts. She invited the salvage man back and paid him generously for his piece of iron. She placed it in the study, where it could serve as a reminder. Memory had weight and shape. She placed the photograph of the silver gate beside Kate's locket, and, for the first time in many years, allowed herself to set the two down without trying to bury them. It felt like an offering rather than a trap. Vivienne and Emily developed rituals that were less about incantation and more about human attentions. A nightly cup of tea shared on the back steps, collection of small items to be tended, a jar in which they placed thoughts they did not wish to keep as burdens. They made a list of small rules: no solitary rituals, never moving the book without 2 witnesses, light left burning in the nursery when storms came. These were not contracts drawn up in legalese. They were promises, fragile but honest. There were residual nights when the sound of laughter brushed the rafters, a dry, playful thing that might have been a bird or the attic pipes. Sometimes Vivienne woke with Kate's name on her tongue and the sensation of that old ledger opening. Each time, she felt the temptation to chase the past. She reached for Emily's hand instead. Those small acts became a new architecture, not a removal of grief, but a companioning of it. They began to record their experiences in a ledger that was not about ownership of truth, but about accountability. Names, times, sensations, they wrote them down. Vivienne found that writing the things into a shared place did not reduce their pain, but made it less capable of reshaping the world without permission. The book, too, sat more often in its cedar box than out of it. Months passed with a rhythm that suggested neither final victory nor surrender. The shadows were quieter, perhaps because they had been shown the boundary of a community rather than the solitude of an undefended mind. Once, in the late afternoon when the sun flung itself like a coin across the pool, Vivienne saw a smear of shadow move along the far hedgerow and felt the old thrill of fear. She called Emily, and together they watched the smear unspool and flatten like someone rolling up a sleeve. It retreated and left behind a scent like rain and old books.
On a day when the sky had that hard, clear quality of late spring, Vivienne unlocked the cedar box and lifted the book. She did not open it for a spell of instruction. She opened it because she had learned to be brave in smaller acts. The leather was cool, and the glyphs, under light, had the faintest suggestion of life, like a thing that waited patiently. She ran her thumb along the circle and slash that marked its cover. For the first time in a long while, the mark looked less like accusation and more like an invitation to keep paying attention. Emily came into the room carrying teacups. She sat beside Vivienne and did not look at the book. They drank in companionable silence, the kind that is forged in the long trenches of shared survival. "You held the gate with me," Vivienne said finally, the words a shape she had only recently learned to pronounce. "You held more," Emily replied. The answer was flat and true and delightedly human. "You chose someone who is here." Vivienne laughed, a small, surprised sound. The laugh sent a quick, tiny ruffle through the curtains. Outside, as if to underline that the world retained its mysteries, something like a wind made a soft, almost amused sound. It could have been a laugh. It might have been nothing at all. The ambiguity was, in the end, the point. They had not banished everything. The book's heartbeat was steadier, but not silenced. The shadows receded from their present, as if cowed, but not dead. There would be other nights when a sound would inch through the hallway and make the staff glance up. There would be other small bargains, choices, and moments when the past would knock and expect doorways to open. They had bought no permanent peace. They had bought togetherness and a sharper willingness to make the right choice when the next test came. Vivienne kept Kate's locket on a chain now, not hidden beneath a blouse, but loose in a small locket dish on the study table. It was a small sanctity she could look at without empire building or evasion. She wrote a letter once, to Kate, if such posthumous letters hold meaning, an odd, clumsy thing where she apologized and told small truths, and, importantly, forgave herself in a line that felt like stepping into daylight. She did not expect an answer. She did it because action matters. The house, for its part, settled into a new map. Candlelight and shadow remained motifs in the way rooms were lived in. Candles for attention, shadows for stories not yet told.
the book remained dangerous and beloved in equal measure. It had given them frights and revelations, and that wild ambiguity ensured they treated it with the respect it demanded. In the quiet months, Vivienne found herself less interested in mapping every inch of property than she had been before. She took long walks in the garden with Emily, not as an employer and employee, but as two people who had learned the ledgers of each other's grief.
They spoke about small things: Emily's childhood street, Vivienne's rare recipe for lemon tart. They joked, and the jokes were savage in their tenderness. Sometimes they spoke of the gate and what it had shown them. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence, their hands now often finding each other in the dark. The laughter in the wind returned now and then, thin and distant as a coin spun on wood. It made Vivienne look up and, somewhere between fear and recognition, smile. The thing had been thwarted, but not defeated. That much Vivienne accepted as a fact that did not reduce the value of what she had gained. If this story haunted you, like and share, and tell us what you'd do in the comments.